And you're all set.
Awesome. Thanks, Gary. I think everybody can see my screen. Gary, is that true? Can you see it?
Yep.
Okay, great. Um, yeah, so I'm excited to talk to you guys today about a project that's been ongoing since well before I started. I think, the initial planning was in the early 2010s, and some of the data I'll be reporting on was collected way back in 2014. So it's been a long project, but a really exciting one, and I think a really successful one. So I'm excited to share this with you. Yeah. All right, and so just given the long-term nature of the project, there's been so many people that have worked on this project, and I was actually dig up some old pictures here that made me chuckle. Some of my colleagues, well before I knew them, working on this project. But I do want to highlight one person in particular who's actually not pictured here, which is Iris Sito. Um, she was instrumental in leading the analysis and some of the data collection as well, and really bringing this project and getting the most out of it for our program and yeah, for our stakeholders in Massachusetts as well. And I think actually, well, I admit that I misplaced the picture I was going to put of her up here. I think she probably would appreciate these pictures of her coworkers instead of hers, knowing Iris. But yeah, I can't say enough about the work she's put in on this. And really, it's what this is her work, and I'm just lucky enough to be able to present it. And I just want to also shout out that this work had just been accepted a couple months ago in estuaries and coasts. So always happy for folks to follow up with me on if they have questions, but I'd also encourage people to go check out the publication. Again, this is another big accomplishment coming out of this project. Right. So into kind of the project itself. You know, the impetus or the why for this project is that eelgrass and boating, in particular mooring fields, uh, overlap quite a bit here in Massachusetts, and that's not just a Massachusetts um, issue or a circumstance. This is true for eelgrass up and down the East Coast, and it's also common in many other species of SAV that inhabit coastal systems throughout the world, areas in Europe and Australia. Managers and harbor masters are kind of struggling with these same um, questions of the demand for boating, particular recreational boating access, and moorings, and as well as these sensitive habitats that are located in protected harbors. So I've just thrown some stats up here in this slide, which really just demonstrate that in Massachusetts, this is a very pervasive throughout the state. Basically from wherever we find eelgrass, very often there are moorings there as well, and vice versa. All right. So the interaction between moorings and eelgrass tends to be a negative one in that, at least from the eelgrass perspective, um, there are, as far as I'm aware, there are not really any negative impacts of eelgrass on a mooring per se, but the particularly the chain of the moorings can be a real problem for eelgrass as it swings around the central block. It scours the bottom and the substrate and can, as I've shown here, can rip up eelgrass shoots, rhizomes and all, creating these kind of bare halos or scars around that center anchor point. And I also mentioned that, well, the chain is usually what's responsible for the majority of the impacts in terms of area. Um, the anchors as well, which can be quite large if they're concrete blocks or mushrooms, depending on the boat size, also displace the eelgrass habitat underneath them. Eelgrass requires kind of a sand, sand or substrate to anchor its roots in, and a mushroom anchor or a concrete block doesn't provide that. So those are also incompatible with eelgrass. So, this is this problem was, I would say, recognized, a couple of decades ago. In fact, there's some early research, before the in the 90s, and I think even back to the 80s, where folks have been looking into alternative designs to the chain design, with the goal of reducing impacts to the ecosystems in the harbor, in particular SAV, or Massachusetts eelgrass. So I've just thrown up a couple of the designs here. The floating road design is what's the most common here in Massachusetts, and that's the design that I'm going to talk about for the remainder of the talk. When I say conservation mooring, I'm referring to this floating road design, which involves a helical anchor into the substrate, and then a subsurface float, um, then which is connected to an elastic and positively buoyant um, road, which then runs up the wall column to the very, only a couple of feet below the surface, where it then transitions to chain, where it connects into the buoy. So that's the floating road system. But I did want to point out that there are a number of other designs, ranging from, kind of these complicated, chain designs, and that go out in multiple directions from a center point, to something as simple as attaching floats to a chain to elevate it off the bottom. Again, the designs are both, the goal is to reduce the anchor footprint, and that's where the helical anchor comes in. But again, the majority of these impacts in terms of area are from the chain that scours, and so lifting that chain off the bottom is the goal here. And these designs are with SAV and in Massachusetts here, eelgrass in mind, and that tends to be the habitat that we think is most impacted by this. But there really hasn't been a lot of study on as far as I'm aware, of the impacts of these mooring systems to just like soft bottom habitats, or that's typically where they are, I should say, is that typically moorings are in sandy bottoms. Again, that's a function of where boaters like to be, but also if there were rock bottom habitats, that's another thing where at least in Massachusetts, we don't have a lot of study of that system, those systems and their interaction with moorings. So again, elevating chains off the eelgrass to try to minimize that scour and impacts. All right, so and these have been around a long time. There's still a lot of questions about them, and some of the most common ones, especially from the recreational boater perspectives, are conservation mooring systems reliable? Are they durable? And how do they change how a boat floats or sits in a harbor or in a mooring field? And those are also questions that are of most interest to harbor masters as well. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this talk going over that. I would say quickly that they do tend to be as reliable and as durable as chain alternatives. And how they affect the movement of the boat really seems to depend on the context in the harbor and the conditions there. And again, that's just communication with harbor masters who have these systems in the harbor. But what I am going to focus on for this talk is how these conservation mooring systems interact with the harbor ecosystem, in particular eelgrass. And it's a little surprising that this wasn't, given that these are designed specifically to limit the interactions with eelgrass, or reduce those impacts with moorings. It was surprising to me that they're actually, when we know this project started, that this hadn't been really well studied. And so it makes a lot of sense that by elevating these systems off of the sediment, they should reduce impacts, and that's what you'd expect. But there's nobody actually looked into it in detail before we went out, and a number of these have been or were planned to be installed. So our study design here in Massachusetts to look at this, we used a project that was actually installing moorings across 6 harbors in Massachusetts, from Gloucester all the way down to Falmouth. But we ultimately ended up just focusing on, for this talk, I would say I'm going to focus on 3 of these harbors in Manchester, West Falmouth, and Quistit. In the fall of 2014, The chain moorings were converted into floating roads with helix anchors. And so here I'm just showing a picture of a chain and then the conversion into a floating road. You can see the subsurface buoy right here if you can see my mouse. In each harbor, there were between 8 and 12 moorings, I believe, converted. Ultimately, we were only able to use between 5 and 8 in each harbor. Again, there was, as over the course of the 5 years of the study, there was a number of just idiosyncratic events that happened to some moorings that meant that either they were converted or they were no longer used. And so we excluded those from our analyses. So in terms of monitoring, this was done on scuba. It is very shallow, but just due to visibility and the nature of the data collection on these sites, it was necessary to dive to collect the data. And so generally, right after installation in 2014, divers used where the helix anchor was placed. That was our center mark, and they measured the distance in 8 directions away from that center mark to the edge of the eelgrass bed. And then 5 years later, in 2019, they repeated this. And again, the expectation here is that we would see recovery and that this, the scar, the bare area that was observed in 2014 would be minimized around these conservation moorings. In addition to measuring the size of the scar from in these 8 directions, divers also collected quadrat data from the unscarred area, the distance that was unscarred as measured in 2014, I should say, and then the recovered area if it was present, and then the remaining scar. I mean, the idea here was to try to understand whether the recovered eelgrass was showing similar characteristics as kind of the unimpacted eelgrass farther away from the moorings. Okay, so transitioning into our first results here, I'm going to walk through the figure. I'm going to stay on this figure for a while, so I just want to walk through it with everybody so we're on the same page. So our response here is going to be the change in radius, as I discussed. Let's see, yep, and so that's either the change from the 2014 distance to 2019, and either that was either recovery or possibly it could also be greater impact. And then that was a function of the harbor. So there are 3 harbors here, and those will be color coded. And then also dependent on our the initial scar radius here is the other factor, and that's going to be on the x-axis. These are all distances in meters as well. Right. So just a little more orientation to the figure here. So the red dotted line at the top, that's basically our zero change. So if we'd see no change in the scar size from 2014 to 2019, the points, you'd expect those points to fall right along our zero line. Points above that would suggest that there was actually greater impact following the conversion to our floating road conservation moorings. And below that would suggest or indicates recovery. So eelgrass growing into the scar, the green arrow here, shrinking the size of the scar around that anchor point. Then I've also highlighted the green line here. That's maximum recovery. So again, eelgrass can't recover more than the size of the initial scar. It just grows right to the helix anchor basically, and that would be a complete recovery of the scar. So the no points will fall. Again, the size of the scar determines the maximum possible recovery in this scenario. Okay. So here what the data looks like on the figure. And just a couple quick points off the top is that we saw recovery more often than we saw increased impact when chains were converted to these conservation mooring systems. But full recovery, so points along this close or on this this green line here, was relatively rare. In only one instance did we actually see complete recovery of the scar after 5 years. which I think was, I wouldn't say surprising, but I think we would have thought we might have seen more in that time frame, especially in these smaller scars. And then another point is that you notice these lines, the change in radius increases as initial scar radius increases, and so that means more eelgrass was recovering into larger scars. And really that in some ways you could, the initial thought is, well, that makes sense. There's more area available for the eelgrass to recover into, so you would expect therefore greater recovery, especially in these smaller scars. Maybe eelgrass is actually constrained, and it can only at most, with a scar of 2-meter radius, recover 2 meters before that kind of taps it out. There's no more space. But what I think our data suggest, both the fact that we very rarely saw complete recovery, and the smaller scars, actually less than 1 meter, where we over 5 years you would have expected eelgrass to recover into that bare area, just based on growth rate. We actually never saw a recovery in those scars, and if anything, there was an increase in impact on those small scars. So to us, that suggests that it wasn't actually the available area to recolonize maybe playing some role. I think it actually the bigger component to this result may be that these conservation moorings, while maybe their impact isn't as great around the center point or the anchor point here, they do closer to the anchor point, within a meter or so. There is still tackle to connect the road into the helical anchor, and we suspect, based on kind of our experience diving around these things, that there is still some scour really close to this central anchor point that may be inhibiting eelgrass recovery into these kind of, again, areas of the scar that are closer to the anchor. All right. So then the second component I want to talk about of these results is the effect we found of harbor on recovery. And so we did see that some harbors, particularly West Falmouth, recovered quite a bit more than Manchester, and then we saw Quistit in intermediate. And I think we think there's a couple different things potentially going on with this result. One is that one of the big differences between West Falmouth and Quistit compared to Manchester Harbor is both the tidal range. Is the tidal range here. So Manchester Harbor in northern Massachusetts has quite a much higher tidal range. I think on average, 8 or 9 feet compared to these sites south of the Cape, which are closer to 3 feet difference in tidal range. So we think that what this means is that when you have a larger tidal range, you need a longer road for the boat and the mooring to float at high tides. And that means that, and then at low tide, there's a lot more excess of mooring road. And we think that excess road at low tide, especially in these high tidal range areas, may be increasing kind of the impact of the mooring road on the benthic areas around the anchor in these systems. And that's something that others have found in these other high tidal range systems, is that these conservation moorings tend to be less effective in high tidal range. And then the second thing I want to point out is that this difference between Falmouth and Quistit. Well, they are very close to each other in terms of distance, and we think that, and so that means that they really have similar tidal range. Quistit Harbor is quite a bit shallower than West Falmouth Harbor, and we think that, again, in these shallow areas where there's just not a lot of the eelgrass is taking up the majority of the water column. There's not a lot of distance for a floating road to go to get outside of where the chutes are so that eelgrass can be foot to 3 feet off the bottom. And so if in a shallow area, if it's only 4 feet, a floating road could still be moving through the canopy quite often. And we think that might be explaining some of those differences. And then finally, at these sites, we also think that there's differences in exposure that might have also been in terms of like exposure to wave action that might and currents that might be affecting our results, and that could be in terms of how they're influencing the eelgrass recovery in terms of its life history. So eelgrass can grow clonally, but also reproduce using seeds. And the rate of recovery in West Falmouth and Quistit Harbor was greater in terms of area per year. The eelgrass recovered into the scar was greater than what you'd expect based on just vegetative growth. Whereas in Manchester Harbor, the results were more in line with if the plants had just been recovering clonally. So we think that this suggests that these more southern harbors, which are more protected, they may be better or more amenable to seed-based recruitment compared to Manchester Harbor, where the currents and the wave action there might be harder for seedlings to establish, and that might slow the recovery in that harbor. Okay. So then our second question, which was, does this recovered eelgrass, how does it compare to what, the natural or, unimpacted bed or, bed outside of the range of these scars looks like? And so here we have, again, our three harbors. And then on the x-axis, these are different zones. So we have the remaining scars, RS, the recovered eelgrass is RE, and then the unscarred eelgrass is the US here. And our response here was shoot density. And we're interested in shoot density because it's correlated with some of the important ecosystem functions that eelgrass provides, whether that's habitat for fishery species and other marine organisms, or preventing erosion and resuspension of sediments. So, what the good news here is that, and the simple takeaway is that while there's some differences in the morphology of eelgrass among harbors, generally the recovered eelgrass was very similar to our unscarred eelgrass, and definitely was much higher in density than the remaining scar area, which makes a lot of sense, seeing as it was a scar. So yeah, this suggests that the recovery is these recovered areas are providing the functions of the unimpacted areas in these harbors. So in summary, these moorings, these conservation moorings, they reduce, but they don't eliminate impacts. And so from a management perspective, we really recommend that chain moorings are converted to conservation moorings where that's feasible. And if there's limitations in funding or availability, then moorings with larger scars should be prioritized for conservation over these smaller scar areas. And then finally, new moorings, really regardless of design, we don't recommend being placed in eelgrass habitat. Again, this is because while conservation moorings do seem to reduce impacts to eelgrass, they do not completely eliminate them. And this is in the background of the context in Massachusetts, at least, is that we've seen quite a lot of loss of eelgrass over the last couple of decades, in the order of hundreds of acres. And so, really, and I would say that's coupled with significant challenges in restoring eelgrass. We've only restored eelgrass on a magnitude of half acres or single acres. So that the loss compared to what we can restore is really they're really not comparable. And so that suggests we really need to try to be avoiding new impacts wherever possible. And then in terms of conservation moorings and what the next steps are from there, I think increasing incentivization, whether that's in terms of dollar amounts or whether it's related to access, is definitely going to continue to be important in terms of getting buy-in from the public and folks converting their moorings from chain to these conservation systems. Again, our study, these conversions were funded through an effort, and so they were not at any cost to the boaters to convert their moorings, which I think was an important aspect of getting folks to to volunteer to take this on. And then obviously, continued education regarding eelgrass and prevent it becoming the forgotten habitat. And then I also think, some kind of out of the box ideas would be that word association is actually, I think, really important here. Chain moorings are often referred to as traditional moorings. And I think that, tradition is a word that's associated with, maybe that's associated with the holidays, or maybe you watched the Masters last weekend, which is, a tradition like no other. But so I think that word has a lot of baggage associated with it, and it's a positive baggage. And so if chain moorings are considered traditional moorings, I think that makes people, well, why do we want to, we don't want to change tradition, but I don't think anybody really has true traditions around their chain moorings, in the kind of sense that the word means. So again, I think sometimes it's important how we refer to these things in terms of their perception. And then finally, I want to talk about this idea of peer influence. And so again, this is the idea that people are looking around and they are influenced by what their with others around them are doing, and especially and this includes in an environmental context. So whether that's commuting to work by a bike or an EV vehicle, or putting solar panels on your home, there's there's increasing studies out there that show that there's high spatial correlation between in these behaviors, and that suggests that people are potentially that one of the reasons for that is that there's influence from one person to the next. Once one person puts solar panels on their house in a community, they're very visible, and people see that, and they start, oh, well, maybe I can do that on my property. And so that's kind of the idea there. And for moorings, I think the real challenge is that there's not really a visual component to a conservation mooring. All the tackle is below the water, so you would never, again, here's just as a kind of fun exercise, like, can you guess which one of these moorings has a chain versus a conservation tackle on it? And you really can't. There's from the surface, there's no way to tell what kind of mooring system is underneath the water. And so there is it's going to be hard to have a pure effects with the status quo. Maybe people have these conservation moorings, but nobody would know about them unless you were perhaps the owner or the installer. And so this led me to thinking about, well, how could we solve this problem? And I have a toddler right now. We do a lot of reading of children's books, and so I was reading, one of our favorites is Bert Dow, Deep Water Man, and I don't know if you're not familiar with this book. It's quite a long story, but the part I want to talk about is at one point, Bert here puts a Band-Aid on one of the tails of the whale, one of these whales, and all the other whales see that Band-Aid, and they get jealous of the whale with the Band-Aid, that they don't have a fun peppermint-shaped Band-Aid on their tail. And so then Bert has to go through every whale and add a peppermint-shaped Band-Aid. And again, or peppermint striped Band-Aid. And again, this is the idea that, visual cues are really important, and people react to them. And, if you see a visual cue, you might, I want that. And so, what I think maybe we could use is a Bert Dow for our visual, mooring balls. What if we had peppermint striped mooring balls, and that indicated a conservation mooring. And if you saw all these pink, peppermint striped mooring balls around a harbor, and you were the only one without a mooring ball with peppermint stripes, you might think, maybe it is something I should consider. So again, this kind of potential future direction, and something I'm still just starting to reach out to folks about the feasibility and what this could look like. And again, I'm not set on the peppermint stripes is just kind of an example, but it's an idea that I'm excited about, at least kind of pursuing further to see whether there's any potential where we could test out these kind of ideas. So with that, I'll leave it for questions, and thanks so much.
Thanks, Forrest. Are there any questions for Forrest? You can either unmute yourself or put something in the chat. Dave? Oh, Dave's just clapping. I'll ask a quick question. What's the cost differential between the more conservative moorings and the traditional chain moorings?
It's pretty difficult to say, exactly. There is some studies out here, and I can I can send literature to folks who are interested, but it can depend on your harbor. And what I will say is that again off the top is that in terms of maintenance and lifespan, both of these systems do need to be replaced. And conservation moorings are pretty new. I think they they say they can last for 10 years before needing to be replaced. But many of them are just coming up on that time frame now. As somebody with a family boat that is on a conservation mooring, I will say that our mooring didn't make it the full 10 years, but chain has to be replaced fairly regularly as well. So there's those considerations. I do think they are more costly. The installations I think were between 2,000 and 3,000 per mooring to switch. But again, some of that is the installation of the helical anchor, which is more of a one-time thing rather than the rods themselves. The rods I think are between 500 to 1,500, but it does depend on the length of the road and the depth there as well. So,
thanks.
Yep.
Other questions? Dave Martins. Hi, Forrest. What are the disadvantages of the concrete block mooring and mushroom anchor? Hold on a second. I'll pull up the rest of this.
Yeah, I got it in front of me too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Thanks, Dave. Yeah. So the helix anchor is it really just shrinks the spatial impact of the anchoring system. So the helix anchors are very small in diameter, on the order of inches, whereas a mushroom anchor and a concrete block are sometimes tens, if some concrete blocks can be hundreds of square feet there, depending on the size of the boat. So it really does just reduce the footprint of the anchor. So I guess I'm talking from a kind of a ecological perspective. There may be other advantages in terms of holding power and stuff like that, but that's again, I could refer you to what's been studied out there, but yeah, it's just an area thing.
Got it. Thanks.
And I guess I would also say that it really is it's the swing of the chain that is really causing most of the impacts here. In terms of the proportion of impacts is largely due to the swing of the chain. That's a much larger area than an anchor, even though some of these anchors can be quite large.
Other questions? Well, not seeing any. Just wanted to thank Forrest for his seminar today. And to remind everyone, we're going to have another seminar on Tuesday, April 30th, and our offshore wind specialist, Justin Bopp, will be giving a presentation on the offshore wind development off Massachusetts. So hope to see you there. So thanks again, Forrest, and hope everyone has a nice weekend.
Thanks everybody for tuning in.